our respected all guest speakers. We would like to thank all of you for coming here to participate this informal discourse on Muslim world affairs, particularly the special topic on Islam in Australia. So Alhamdulillah, we are very happy that our two distinguished guest speakers are with us, and also some distinguished guests also with us. Inshallah, we will enjoy this discussion with wisdom, information, knowledge, and insight. Our main approach to focus some contemporary issues which actually related with in favor, welfare of Muslim communities around the world. For the reason, although Australia is not a part of Muslim world, but in a broader sense, we always consider the Muslim communities, Muslim affairs is a part of Muslim world. So in this perspective or in this aspect, we have considered the Islam in Australia and other non-Muslim countries, particularly in Islam in Russia, Islam in Japan, Islam in America, Islam in Europe, also the part of Muslim. I would like to refer a quotation view from the Tahzaber al-Anani. He emphasized we should form the Ummah. He said we have to form the Muslim Ummah based on Islamic identity around the world. So our approach, from the current Muslim world, we will look at our advanced approach from all kind of Islamic and Muslim affairs around the world, including non-Muslim areas. In this aspect, the Islam in Australia, Muslims life in Australia, culture in Australia, political approach in Australia related to Muslim interests is very important, not only for the Muslim in Australia, it's also important for around the world. A recent issue we will also focus in our discussion, the Australian government approach to Palestine. We are not happy. Whole world are against of this approach. Recently, one of the greatest important Muslim leaders, Tun Mahathir, already protest very vehemently that Australia cannot do it. So we will refer. This is a very current issue. So so that Australia cannot recognize the Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. We will request, we will appeal, we will make intellectual, academic pressure to Australian government to consider the real policy in favor of Palestine. Already Dr. Shahjahan Khan already posted a very latest message from Australian government. The Australian government trying to minimize his approach in favor of also Palestine. So now we are going to start our discourse formally. Today, this event will be chaired by our co-chairman and co-founder, prominent Muslim scholar, poet, former deputy dean of ISTAC, former dean of National Cultural University, Aswara, Professor Dato Baharuddin Ahmad. He is the chair of this event and main speaker. To our speaker, Professor Shahjahan Khan, already we introduced his position as a professor of Southern Queensland University, Australia. He originally from Bangladesh, and he is one of the leading Muslim scholar nowadays. Particularly, his area is the academic field, and in his field he is very prominent. We would like to congratulate him because 2 days ago he received an honor from his university. The excellent award of the university. Just to it is a good news for Muslims because a Muslim professor received the excellent award from the Western educational field. It is a good news. Secondly, our very good brother, converted Muslim, Brother Garry, He currently he's a PhD candidate, but he's a very senior man. He has lots of experience with both culture, Muslim culture, non-Muslim culture. And I have found him in his writing, in his approach. He is very much concerned about the current issues related to Muslim welfare. He is sometimes very much critical about some policy, some approach which has gone against the Muslim interest. And he always tried to focus the current issues, promising issues from also Muslim world, particularly Islam and Muslim in Australia. So we hope he will give a new type of insight about the issue. Then we have a special guest, Dr. Sharif Shawama, one of the very fighter, intellectual jihadist on Muslim interest, but he is nowadays fighting for Al-Quds and interest of Muslim Ummah in Palestine. But we have considered him, he is our good friend, he is our good captain, not only for Palestine, for whole Muslim Ummah. We are going to focus all the crises related in Kashmir, related in Syria, related in Uyghur, related in Afghanistan, related in other places, Yemen. He will join with us. We have a very good friendship. So I hope he will give his new type of insight to the discussion. And also present here, Engineer Nasim.
Yes,
Brother Nasim from UK. He is also very prominent Muslim activist. Dr. Salahuddin, our honorary director of Muslim Malaysia Center. And we have found another guest from Bangladesh, prominent journalist and television anchor on Islamic program and cultural and educational activist of Bangladesh based on Islam, Mr. Jainul Abidin Azad. Personally, he is a writer, and he is particularly he is very famous for the Islamic-based children movement. So he is a former director of National Center of the Fulkuri of Bangladesh. So we will enjoy also his views and insight. And also we have some promising youth leader and another brother from Abdul Qayyum Manjur. He is a very corporate personality. He has a very good experience from Saudi Arabia as a banker, and he is a good guardian and patron for Islamic approach and movement and socio-cultural things. So, okay, now we are going to start our discussion. I would like to request Brother Idris to recite some verses from Holy Quran, and please.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله ولتنظر نفس ما قدمت لغد واتقوا الله إن الله خبير بما تعملون ولا تكونوا كالذين نسوا الله فأنساهم أنفسهم أولئك هم الفاسقون لا يستوي أصحاب النار وأصحاب الجنة أصحاب الجنة هم الفائزون لو أنزلنا هذا القرآن على جبل لرأيته خاشعا متصدعا من خشية الله وتلك الأمثال نضربها للناس لعلهم يتفكرون صدق الله العظيم.
ও একটু কমাই দিবা, ঠান্ডা বেশি লাগে।
Thank you very much, Mr. Idris. Now I would like to request Brother our speaker, honorable speaker, Brother Garry Mitchell Dargan.
Garry Michael Dargan.
Oh, Garry Michael Dargan. So he will actually present the origin and little history of Islam in Australia, how Islam spreaded there and how worked it very positively among the non-Muslim and Australian citizens. So now I would like to request deliver his speech, please, Brother Garry.
Okay. I did have a very large PowerPoint presentation to go through, but since we haven't got a projector and so on, we'll go through this fairly quickly. You all should realise that we're living in a part of the world which is the Islamic world, and if you look at the maps, the Muslim world by 1500, the year 1500 CE, had reached basically this part of the world. But it was here far earlier than that. There's evidence going back as far as 825 from an Arab shipwreck, which has Chinese porcelain in it, which has blue glaze from Iraq on it. That's actual evidence that there was a maritime Silk Road running from Yemen all the way down through the Straits of Malacca and up into China. So there's been quite a Muslim presence in this region. And it should come as no surprise, therefore, that the first contact with Australian Aboriginals was through Muslims coming down from the northwest to hunt for or to harvest trepang and crocus shell for the Chinese market. They'd come down on the January trade winds and sail back to their home base in July and do their trading up into China. We know this from several sources. There are Aboriginal rock paintings showing Macassan prows and their smokehouses for trepang. There's even a site where, in order to record what had happened, the Aborigines made diagrams out of stones. They laid stones out which showed the patterns of houses, cross-sectional diagrams of the prows, the boats that the Macassans came down on and so on. Those particular stone carved or stone pictures have recently been restored and repaired, and they've gone back to being part of the educational program for Aborigines in Northern Australia. It was an educational program which was largely lost in the 19th century when European settlers basically laid waste to Aboriginal culture and began essentially a program of cultural extermination. The Macassan contact probably goes back 3 centuries or so before European contact. So you're looking at 1200, 1300, something like that. Certainly early explorers in 1803, Matthew Flinders, who was the first explorer to completely sail around Australia in Northern Australia, met with a Malay prow captain named Pobasu, who said he'd been coming there since 1770. And that's a significant date because that was the year that Captain Cook discovered Australia. Of course, the Muslims were there first. They even beat the Russians, if you know the in-joke. So we have that wonderful story. There are Macassan words in Northern Aboriginal languages. Just one example is Balanda for Hollander, but there are apparently hundreds of words which have come across, and there are some Aboriginal words which have come across into Macassan languages as well. It was a very benign trade system. They would sail up, the Macassans would sail up onto a beach, set up a camp, light a fire, wait for the Aboriginals to come down, and they spoke the languages, which is pretty much a great achievement because there are actually over 250 Aboriginal dialects in Australia, but some of the dialects are in common. and they would negotiate a trade pact, which was, something that the Europeans never did with the Aboriginals, and it was mutually beneficial. An interesting sidelight from that, there's two of them. One thing is the Aborigines have an oral cultural history through song lines, so their history is recorded in song, and there is at least one song line which is actually a verbal account of one of these contacts, which is held in the memory of one of the Aboriginal elders. There's also a farewell song that they sing at any gathering when they're breaking up and going back from a big get-together, which they used to sing when the Macassans departed back over the horizon. When the Aborigines tried to reclaim their land, because the Europeans basically came along and said, well, nobody lives here, because the Aborigines were classed as flora and fauna, they weren't considered to be human beings, they decided the land belongs to Europe. It's ours to take. The Aborigines, in order to reclaim it, actually used this oral history to reclaim their land rights, including their offshore land rights. And to mark the offshore land that they now have title to, they use a flag which is based on an Aboriginal symbol called the Bawu. And the Bawu is a representation of the sail of the Macassan prow against the horizon. So it's a blue and white flag which they put in the tide zone to mark their land. So there's this very deep, long-term connection between Muslims and the Australian Aboriginals. Today, the census figures say there are about 1,400 Aboriginal Muslims in Australia, but there are family connections between places like Macassar, between the Celebes and Northern Australia, where they'd intermarry and travel back and forth. So there are family relations between the two islands. Moving along, when Australia was first settled by Europeans in 1788, when the first fleet came out, there were Muslims on the first fleet. I have a friend who can not only trace, he's a Muslim, who can not only trace his ancestry back to Aboriginals, but he could trace his ancestry back to two passengers who were on the first fleet to arrive to settle Australia. And they weren't Muslims, of course, but they used Muslim crewmen. In particular, they used Muslim crewmen as navigators because they knew their way around this part of the world. They had, in 1796, for instance, there was an Australian-built ship was wrecked off Norfolk Island, and Muslim sailors were basically deposited on Norfolk Island, which is just off the coast of New South Wales, settled there briefly, then moved to Tasmania. So all the way back then, in the early days of the colony, there were still Muslims around. We moved from that to the mid-19th century, 1850s, 1860s. Australia had the way across the mountain ranges had been found, and Central Australia was being opened up. But to open it up, they needed people who could manage to find their way around through desert environments and so on. And someone came up with a brilliant idea of bringing camels out to navigate and explore the desert areas. But to bring camels out, they had to bring people out to handle the camels. And they brought out the Afghans, Muslims. They strictly weren't Afghanis, they were from what was then known as British India, which included Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh and a few other stans around the place. But basically they were Muslims from the Indian subcontinent. They essentially came in from about 1860 through to about the 1900s before they stopped bringing them out. They opened up large parts of Australia. They built the first mosque in Central Australia called the Mwrc Mud Mosque. They built it out of adobe and what they call wattle and daub, basically tree branches smeared with mud. And that was a main crossover point for a lot of the camel trains. They were not allowed to bring their wives out, so they married into the Australian Aboriginal community, and They also married what were loosely called widows, European widows, who were actually, believe it or not, many of them were prostitutes. But they made honest women of them. And there are people now who can trace their ancestry back and remember people who ran the camels, who know the names and so on of all their family members who were Afghani camel handlers. The two great expeditions exploring Australia, first was the Burke and Wills expedition. That travelled from Adelaide all the way up north, almost as far as Darwin. I went up to the Gulf of Carpentaria. They took camels, and to handle the camels they took along Afghani Muslim camel handlers. Unfortunately for Burke and Wills, being arrogant Englishmen, they thought they knew everything, and halfway through they sent their camel handlers back, went on their own, didn't know anything about how to look after camels, and their camels died, they lost all their stores, and they died of thirst and starvation. A later expedition, the Giles expedition, which went looking for Burke and Wills, took more Afghani Muslims along, and they found where Burke and Wills had been buried by the local Aboriginals and recovered their remains. So they were very important to the actual exploration and development of Australia. My mother's hometown of Coolgardie, which is on the goldfields in Western Australia, for many years was dependent upon Afghani cameleers to bring water in because it was in the middle of the desert. My great uncles packed their wheelbarrows up and walked from Bendigo and Ballarat in Victoria to Port Augusta in South Australia, which is over 1,000 kilometres, took a ship to Perth and Fremantle, then walked for 600 or so kilometres through the desert to get to the goldfields. And the town of Coolgardie was dependent upon water brought in by the Afghanis. To give you an idea of how important it was, at one point the population of Coolgardie was 30,000 people. It had no doctor and 3 nurses. And they had a typhoid epidemic, and half the town was down with typhoid because of lack of clean water. They weren't treated terribly well. They had problems crossing borders because at that stage Australia was a series of states. So the Afghanis and their camels were taxed every time they crossed a state border. They were also out on contract, and when their contract ended they were supposed to return home, but many of them didn't. And they would put notices out for them to be caught and brought back for deportation. And they were described as prohibited Chinese immigrants. The fear of the Chinese in Australia, which goes way, way back, was back then. And anybody who came from sort of west of Darwin was Chinese to them. But many of them stayed on and settled. We have a number of quite significant descendants of Afghani Muslims in the community, one of whom is Baharuddin, who's a Muslim author of Afghani descent, who has written a book called Caravanserai, which is basically migration stories of Australian Muslims. In Adelaide, they built a large mosque, which for a brief period of time fell out of use and became part of the national estate, and the Muslims had to campaign to the government to get it back as a mosque, but they now have it, and it's a classic mosque built in Afghani style with the Afghani style minarets. In opening up Australia, they carried supplies for the overland telegraph from basically Adelaide to Darwin, which connected up with an overland, an undersea cable to send cables all the way through to Britain. They carried the supplies for that. The Adelaide to Darwin rail line, which runs north to south across Australia, was essentially built using materials carried in on camelback by the Afghanis. It's now in their memory is called, the train that runs on that line is now called the Dargan. So there is quite a significant history. There's one little problematic episode that happened with the Afghani Muslims, and that was at Broken Hill on the 1st of January in 1915. Turkey entered the war against Britain, and of course Australia was allied with Britain, and was busy trying to land on Gallipoli. So two actually Afghani ice cream sellers of Broken Hill decided that they had to fight on the side of the Ottoman Caliphate. So they loaded up their ice cream cart, put on their uniforms, put up the Turkish flag and took their guns out, and they ambushed the Broken Hill picnic train and killed a few people. Now, some people will call that terrorism. I don't know. It was a shot fired in anger during a war. I mean, they were fighting for the Ottoman Caliphate and not for ISIS. So that created quite a stir back in those days. There's another Malay presence. When the pearling industry started up in the northwest of Western Australia, Malays were employed on the pearling luggers as divers and basically to clean up the shells and extract the pearls and so on. They had an interesting history in that they were very badly treated. Many of them went on strike for higher wages. The pearling companies brought in Japanese divers and paid them lower wages to undercut the Malay wages, and the Malays went on strike in protest. The Malays the troublemakers were identified, rounded up and deported. One of those who was deported was a guy called Samsuddin bin Khatib. Samsuddin bin Khatib in World War II had joined the Australian Army and fought the Japanese with considerable courage. Yet that service didn't stand him in any stead. He was actually classed as an alien and deported from the country because he stood up for his rights and refused to take something like a 60% pay cut. So you have, again, Muslims being a history of bad treatment of Muslims in Australia. Now, if we go to the current situation, Australia has a population of roughly 23 million. A little over 600,000 of them are Muslim. 36% of Muslims are born in Australia, and we have quite a young community in Australia. Roughly 10% of Muslims in Australia come from Lebanon, 8% from Turkey. The rest are from other countries such as Afghanistan, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Pakistan, quite a large Indonesian community, a developing Iraqi community coming out after the Gulf Wars, a substantial Fiji Indian Muslim community as a result of a succession of coups in Fiji, and a range of others. The first Muslims other than the Afghanis to come out really were the Albanians, who came out between the two wars and worked in the sugar industry in Queensland and set up other agricultural industries, running fruit orchards and so on. They were largely then followed by the Turks, who were able to come out when they sort of lifted the criteria for who was white and who wasn't, and they were allowed into the country. And they were followed by the Lebanese, who came out as refugees during the Lebanese Civil War. Many of the others have come out since as a result of various wars and so on. They've had, for instance, Iraq, Somalia, Sudan, and so on. And they've all had their various problems, particularly at the moment the Somali and Sudanese have a lot of problems because the government is using them for political cannon fodder, complaining about African Muslim gangs causing problems so they can buy some votes. Religiously, roughly 52% of the population are Christian. That's 12 million people. The next largest religion is Islam at 2.6%, 604,000 people. But a bit of a surprise is that 30% of the Australian population, that's 7 million people, have no religion at all. But Islam is still classed as an emerging religion, although its rate of growth has been taken over by Hinduism just recently. Distribution. Roughly 71.2% of Australian Muslims have completed years 11 or 12, that's following year high school, or tertiary education. The average figure for Australia, of all Australians, is 56%. So they're punching well above their weight And interestingly, more Muslim women have tertiary qualifications than Muslim men. Mainly because I suspect the Muslim family keeps their daughters under very close control. And their boys go out and misbehave a lot and get into all sorts of trouble. Administratively, the community nominally is administered at the top by the Australian Federation of Islamic Councils. Underneath them are state Islamic councils who send representatives to the Federation, and they nominally administer various mosques who send representatives to the state bodies. There are various unaffiliated bodies and so on, and more recently, in recent years, they've set up a board of imams under a Grand Mufti. That's where they stand. It's not as rosy as it seems because, for instance, the Federation of Islamic Councils has managed to create 3 New South Wales Islamic Councils. It keeps dismissing them and creating new ones, but the old ones that they dismiss won't go away. So there are various problems, and there are other groups which have absolutely no affiliation with the Federation. So the community is somewhat divided, but it's slowly getting its act together. The Board of Imams was a very good start. Islamic schools have been well developed in Australia and firmly established. The first Islamic school in Australia was established by a Muslim convert, and she had a hell of a battle to get it going, and they migrated from place to place, from church hall to garages and all over the place, and they had to go to court several times to get approval to build the school. However, most of the religious education still takes place at the mosque, and formal religious qualifications are still sought overseas, but that's starting to change as first and second generation Australian-born Muslims who are qualified overseas come back and set up institutions in Australia. Mosques, I can't give you figures on how many mosques there are in Australia, but there are a huge number. Some of them are quite big. Auburn Mosque cost $13 million Australian to build. It holds several thousand worshippers. It's modelled on one of Sinan's mosques, and every year they put 2,500 visitors through to explain how mosques work and what Islam is about. They're very effective, and on one open day, one day a year, they put 1,500 people through. And it is the only time of the year they're allowed to call the azan from the minarets. Minarets are a problem in Australia. That councils don't like you to put minarets up, and you have quite a struggle. And as for calling the azan, the mosque I helped build, I got access to council files, and they received one person was complaining about the noise of the azan, which is rather strange because we called the azan inside the mosque. And when I checked his address, he lived 60 kilometres from the mosque. So we have a very loud noise in. Most mosques are fairly small. A number of them are converted churches because of an interesting regulation that if you buy a church, it is already approved as a place of worship. That did not stop people from saying, well, Muslims worship differently to Christians, therefore they can't worship in a converted church. That ruling, which was actually upheld by a judge, was very quickly overturned by the government after an enormous amount of outrage from guess who? The Christian church. So that didn't stop that very mosque having other problems. It was, for instance, twice been firebombed. We do have a lot of problems. Mosques are a planning problem. In one suburb in Sydney, there's a large market which holds a parking lot holding over 10,000 cars. It's built like a mosque. On the other side of the road, the Muslim community wanted to build a mosque holding less than 1,000 cars. It took them 3 years of fighting through council to get approval. I don't know if you follow the news in Australia, but Bendigo recently was building a mosque, and they had mass demonstrations from an organisation called the United Patriots Front, or the Australian Patriots Front, or the True Blue Crew. Basically right-wing, extremist, neo-Nazi, you name it, Australians who were opposed to anything to do with Islam. They are well linked in with groups from overseas. They get advice, money and logistical support from overseas hate groups. This is gradually being exposed, and is a significant emerging problem which the government is failing to do anything about because the government happens to like the hate groups. I'll explain why in a minute. However, there's a large contingent of Australians who stand up to them and will fight to defend the rights of Muslims to build their mosque. And in the case of Bendigo, when the Patriot Front turned out for a big protest, they were met with a counter-protest which was so big they had to pack up and go home. To give you an idea of the danger, one of the members of the hate group turned up at one of the protests with a taser, capsicum spray and a gun. He was actually charged, surprise, surprise, but he wasn't called a terrorist. We had the similar problems in Sydney with a small mosque being built at a suburb called Penrith. How many people have heard of Pauline Hanson? Oh, you definitely would have. Her claim to fame is A, she hates Muslims, B, she wore a burqa into the Australian Parliament to protest about Muslims, and C, she called on all Australians to boycott Cadbury Easter eggs because they were halal and would lead to the Islamisation of Australia. Some people say she looks better in the burqa. She got her career started off by attacking Aboriginals, then moved to Asian, mostly Japanese tourists, who wouldn't patronise her fish shop because she ran a fish and chip shop, and then she moved on to Muslims. She sort of does the flavour of the month. We have other problems. For instance, another minor party. Australia has a lot of little tiny minor micro parties in the Senate, and they hold the balance of power in the upper house. So if the government wants to get its legislation through, it has to do deals with them. One of them is a party, a North Queensland party. Its senator in his maiden speech called for a final solution to ban Muslim migration. He used the language of the Holocaust. He was supported by his party leader, who's a Lebanese, he won't admit it, but his family originally migrated from Lebanon. They were Lebanese Christians. His name is Fraser Anning, and his grandfather ran a cattle property in North Queensland. His great-grandfather ran a cattle property in North Queensland and proudly boasted of hunting down and killing Aboriginals. So the whole family's got blood on their hands. Another man, Corey Bernardi, who's from the Australian Conservatives, also wants Muslims banned. It's time to talk about Islam, is one of his famous sayings. Another guy called George Christensen, who is a member of the government, very much anti-Islam and hates Muslims. He's a fundamentalist right-wing Christian. He's also just been caught out doing tours of